Daniel chapter 9, prophecy about Jesus. This prophecy about Jesus is unique in the Bible. It's also really, really important because of the nature of this prophecy.
Isaiah 7:14. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel.
Isaiah 9:6 says, For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, we know this to be a prophecy about Jesus made 700 years before he was born.
You have to ask yourself, who actually fulfilled this? Who actually died, and his own people thought he was dying for his sin, and yet he was dying for the sins of the whole world? Who was it that didn't defend himself, that went as a lamb to the slaughter? Who was it that not only was cut off from the land of the living and died, but then continued on, saw the light of life, continued alive? Who was it that bore the sin of many? Who was it because of whom kings of the earth have shut their mouths in awe and said, we never knew, we never understood?
There are no prophecies that point to a New Testament Messiah within the Hebrew Scriptures. The main prophecies that are argued are either mistranslations, misinterpretations, or just completely taken out of context. The only reason that someone would think there are prophecies that point to a Christ figure is because they read the Old Testament with a New Testament mindset. You have to read the Hebrew Scriptures within the context that they were written. In order for Christianity to exist within the Old Testament, you would have to take the words of the Creator in the Old Testament out of context. The existence of a Christ dying for the sins of mankind is a total contradiction to the words and actions of the Creator in the Old Testament. No man can die for another man's sin is a law that was repeated numerous times throughout the Hebrew writings, namely Deuteronomy 24:6. Jeremiah 31:30, and all of Ezekiel chapter 18. We're going to go one by one to uncover the true context surrounding prophecies that are assumed by many, if not all, Christians that are describing the coming of Christ in the New Testament. One so-called messianic prophecy that recently surfaced that Christians are beginning to use deals with the genealogy of Adam that is listed in Genesis chapter 5. Christians are stating that the Hebrew names of Adam's descendants point to a prophecy about a coming Christ figure.
So, in this, we see that all of their names read the message. From the beginning of man, their names read the message. Man has appointed moral sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching, and his death shall bring the despairing comfort. Bro, what?
This would be a valid argument. Except, a lot of those name translations are incorrect. In Hebrew, the name Seth does not mean appointed. It means to substitute. This is because Seth was the child that replaced Abel after he was killed by his brother Cain. The name Canaan does not mean sorrow, but it means fixed. Mahalalel does not mean the blessed God, but the praise of God. Enoch does not mean teaching. It means initiated. Methuselah does not mean his death shall bring, as it means man of a dark. Lamech's Hebrew meaning is still unknown, as it comes from an unknown Hebrew root. Therefore, you cannot assume that it means the despairing. The next prophecy we'll discuss is Daniel chapter 7. In verses 13 and 14, Daniel describes a vision that he experienced, and what he saw during it. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Here, Daniel is having a vision about what appears to be a man who was given some type of rulership authority over the whole earth, and his kingdom is said to last forever. It should be noted that all of Daniel's visions are symbolic. He has more symbolic visions earlier in the chapter when he describes the 4 great beasts. These beasts were not actually animals, but they symbolized 4 great kingdoms. The vision in verses 13 and 14 are symbolic, just like his prior vision of the 4 beasts. Daniel describes a man that appeared with the clouds of heaven. These clouds don't represent literal clouds, but they symbolize a promise that was made. In Scripture, clouds were often used in relation to a promise. After the flood, Yahweh set the rainbow in the clouds as a promise that he will never destroy the earth by flood again. During the Exodus, he led the Israelites into the promised land using a pillar of clouds. Him leading Israel into the Holy Land was the fulfillment of the promise that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Clouds represent his promises and his saving ability. So, to interpret Daniel's vision, there is a man that was promised to be given authority over the whole earth, and his kingdom will last forever. In order to find out who this man is, we have to go to the other books of the prophets that write about a similar theme. Isaiah chapter 11 verses 1 through 3. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of Yahuwah will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of Yahuwah, and he will delight in the fear of Yahuwah. Continuing to verse 10. In that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. In this chapter, Isaiah is writing an end-time prophecy regarding a leader who will rise up and have authority over all nations of the earth. We know this is an end-time prophecy since verses 6 through 9 are discussing a time of world peace and worldwide knowledge of Yahuwah. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of Yahuwah as the waters cover the sea. So, who is this root of Jesse that is being referred to, that will become a king over all the earth? The prophet Jeremiah also writes an end-time prophecy. In chapter 30, he describes what will happen to the children of Israel when they will be restored to their former glory as a nation. Chapter 30 verses 8 and 9 state, "In that day, declares Yahuwah Almighty, I will break the yoke off their necks and will tear off their bonds. No longer will foreigners enslave them. Instead, they will serve Yahuwah their Elohim and David their king, whom I will raise up for them." The prophet Ezekiel writes about the same exact scenario in chapter 37. This is his famous dry bones prophecy. "My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. They will live in the land I gave to my servant Jacob, the land where your ancestors lived. They and their children's children will live there forever. And David my servant will be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their Elohim, and they will be my people. Then the nations will know that I, Yahuwah, make Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever." When the children of Israel become restored as a nation, David will return and be king. Ezekiel describing David being the king forever matches exactly what the prophet Daniel writes about his dominion that will be an everlasting dominion. Ezekiel also writes this in chapter 34, verses 23 and 24. "I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I Yahuwah will be their Elohim, and my servant David will be prince among them. I Yahuwah have spoken. The prophet Hosea even touches on this in chapter 3 verse 5. Afterward the Israelites will return and seek Yahuwah their Elohim, and David their king. They will come trembling to Yahuwah and to his blessings in the last days. This prophecy in Daniel chapter 7 is referring to the return of King David as the eternal king over the nations of the earth, not the coming of a New Testament Messiah. That's not the only supposed New Testament prophecy from the book of Daniel. Chapter 9 verses 25 and 26 contains another one of Daniel's visions that Christians assume is speaking about the coming of Christ in the New Testament. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the Messiah will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. This Messiah that is referred to in Daniel chapter 9 is King Cyrus of Persia. Daniel is currently writing while the Israelites were under a period of captivity during the Babylonian exile. Cyrus of Persia defeated the rulers of Babylon and allowed the children of Jacob to return back to the promised land and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Of course, this didn't last long, since the Israelites once again began to stray away from the commandments and fall into sin. This led to Cyrus being cut off, and Jerusalem was destroyed once again. While reading this section in Daniel 9, the confusion comes from the word Messiah. The authors of modern Bibles capitalize the M in Messiah, which leads people to believe that it is referring to Christ. The Hebrew word for Messiah, Mashah, simply means to paint or to anoint. There have been many Messiahs throughout Israel's history. Every single high priest was anointed. Therefore, every single high priest was a Messiah. Every single king in the history of Israel and Judah, whether righteous or wicked, was anointed. Therefore, every single king in the history of Israel and Judah, whether righteous or wicked, was a Messiah. To take it a step further, even the doorposts during the Exodus were painted/anointed with the blood of the Lamb. So technically, they would fall under the Messiah category as well. Being a Messiah was a special privilege, but it was not something that was exclusive to just one individual. Now, how do we know that this word Messiah is referring to King Cyrus of Persia? Well, simply because of Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. This is what Yahuwah says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. In the Hebrew, the same word for Messiah is used for anointed. This next one is nothing but a simple case of mistranslation. Psalm 22:16-18. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. In this section of Psalm, David is writing a prayer to Yahuwah concerning his enemies, of who he compares to animals throughout the whole chapter. He calls them bulls in verse 12, lions in verse 13, dogs in verse 16, lions again in verse 21, wild oxen also in verse 21. However, in verse 16, he makes another comparison that is omitted from many English translations. The Hebrew reads Kari Yad. The word Kari translates to like a lion, Ka meaning like, and a Re meaning lion. The translators confused this word with the Hebrew word Kara, which means to pierce. We can see that the word Ari means lion, since it shows up in Isaiah 38:13, as well as Daniel chapter 6, verse 7. This section of Psalms has nothing to do with Christ on a cross. This is David likening his enemies to animals in a prayer to Yahuwah. Moving on to Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. This is one of two verses that is echoed throughout all of the Christian church walls towards the end of the Gregorian calendar year. Therefore Yahuwah himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and she will call him Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. This is one of the main verses within the Tanakh that is the victim of misinterpretation, mistranslation, and being taken out of context. The original Hebrew does not say virgin. The idea of a virgin birth does not exist within the Hebrew scriptures. The idea of a virgin birth does not exist within nature. The original Hebrew states that this virgin was actually a young woman. Who was this young woman that Isaiah 7 is referring to? The answer lies in the very next chapter. Isaiah 8, 1-4. Yahuwah said to me, "Take a large scroll and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maharshalal Hashbaz." So I called in Uriah the priest and Zechariah son of Jeberechiah as reliable witnesses for me. Then I made love to the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And Yahuwah said to me, "Name him Maharshalal Hashbaz. For before the boy knows how to say my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria." This young woman that is mentioned in Isaiah chapter 7 is the prophetess in Isaiah 8. This woman is Isaiah's wife. The land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste that are mentioned in chapter 7 are Damascus and Samaria, which were mentioned in chapter 8. The fall of Samaria and Damascus is referred to in Isaiah chapter 10 verses 9 and 10. Has not Calno fared like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad, and Samaria like Damascus? As my hand seized the kingdoms of the idols, kingdoms whose images excelled those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images as I dealt with Samaria and her idols? Now, if Damascus and Samaria have already fallen within the book of Isaiah, that means this child that was prophesied in chapters 7 and 8, whose birth coincides with these events, had to have already been born. Not to mention that the child was already born in chapter 8. Since Isaiah writes, "Then I made love to the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son." So, what further proof do we have that this is referring to the same child? First, we have to understand the context within these sections of Isaiah. In this section, there is an alliance between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Aram. The kingdom of Israel had been going to war with the kingdom of Judah for some time after the split of the once unified nation of Israel. This time, Israel makes an alliance with Aram to surround the city of Jerusalem in the territory of Judah. The king of Jerusalem at this time was King Ahaz. The prophet Isaiah comes to this king to tell him that the two kingdoms who surround Jerusalem were going to be destroyed. Again, these are the two kings mentioned in chapter 7 and chapter 8. The important part about this is that Isaiah gives King Ahaz a time frame for when they will be destroyed. He tells the king that his wife, the young woman, the prophetess, is pregnant with a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Only she will call his name Emmanuel. The name Emmanuel, as we all know, translates to God is with us. The meaning of this name is important due to the circumstance that the nation of Judah finds itself in. They are about to be invaded by two nations. So the name of Isaiah's future son is a message to the people of Jerusalem that Yah is still with them. However, in chapter 8, we read that Yah commanded Isaiah to call his son by a different name. Yahuwah said to me, "Take a large scroll and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maharshalal Hashbaz." This name, Maharshalal Hashbaz, translates to hastening the spoil, quicken the booty. The name is essentially a repetition of the same phrase. The explanation of the meaning of this name is given in the second half of those two sections of Isaiah. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. For before the boy knows how to say my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. These are both repeating the same message. They are expressing that before this child has the chance grows up, the two kingdoms of Samaria and Damascus, Israel and Aram, will fall to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria will spoil and lay waste to both of these territories, hence the meaning of the name Mahar-Shalal-Hashbaz. This is the reason for the repetition of the same phrase within the name. The reason the idea of spoiling and plundering is repeated twice is because there are two territories that will be spoiled and plundered. The conception and birth of the child itself is not the sign. It's only a part of it. The rest of the sign is the amount of time after the child was born, which is when those two kingdoms were going to be destroyed. The sign is the child's age. The reason this child is given this name and serves as a sign is due to what we can read in Isaiah 8:18. Here am I, and the children Yahuwah has given me. We are signs and symbols in Israel from Yahuwah Almighty, who dwells on Mount Zion. We can see this in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 3, with Isaiah's other son. Then Yahuwah said to Isaiah, "Go out, you and your son Shear Yashu, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool, on the road to the launderer's field." The meaning of Shear Yashu translates to a remnant will remain or a remnant will return. This name serves as another message of comfort for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Within the context of the events during the life of Isaiah, these passages have nothing to do with a prophecy of a New Testament Messiah. If Isaiah 7:14 is one of the verses recited during Christian services all over the world, then Isaiah 9 verse 6 is the other. This birth also deals with the birth of a child. Verses 6 and 7 read, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever." The zeal of Yahuwah Almighty will accomplish this. Once again, Christians believe this prophecy is talking about Christ. As is the case with the prophecy in chapter 8, the verse indicates that the child has already been born. The birth of the child itself is not the prophecy. What this child will do is the prophecy. When we continue to read the book of Isaiah, the identity of this mystery child is revealed. Isaiah chapter 22, verses 20 through 22. "In that day I will summon my servant, Eliakim son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and fasten your sash around him and hand your authority over to him. He will be a father to those who live in Jerusalem and to the people of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens no one can shut, and what he shuts no one can open." The translation of his name provides another clue that fits into Isaiah 9:6. One smaller example of Christianity inserting Christ in the Old Testament is Proverbs 30:4. "Who has gone up to heaven and come down? Whose hands have gathered up the wind? Who has wrapped up the waters in a cloak? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is the name of his son? Surely you know." If you are familiar with the words of the Creator, you will already know the answer to the question in this verse. Exodus 4:22-23. "Then say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahuwah says. Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go, so he may worship me." Isaiah 1:2. "Hear me, you heavens, listen, earth, for Yahuwah has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. Hosea 1:10. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," they will be called children of the living God. The Creator has made it very clear on multiple occasions that the children of Israel are his children. Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. This is yet another misinterpreted verse. This verse is referenced in the New Testament narrative of Matthew when Christ left the refuge of Egypt after the death of Herod, who sought to kill him. This verse in Hosea has nothing to do with a future prophecy, but a past event. This is Yahuwah recounting his deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egypt during the period of the Exodus. This event already happened. The book of Matthew states this prophecy was fulfilled through Christ. But this event, which isn't a prophecy at all, was a past event that Yahuwah repeatedly recounted throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. Zechariah chapter 9 verse 9. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. This, of course, is one of the most famous verses that Christians use as a prophecy of Christ riding into Jerusalem on the week of his death. However, once again, Christians fail to look at the context. The verse right after it states, "I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." The second verse is a continuation of the first, because the Hebrew says, "And I will take away the chariots from Ephraim. There will be no more war horses from Jerusalem. There will be no more battle bows in use." Once this king proclaims peace to the nations, there will be no more war. Who was the king that was mentioned in the other books of the prophets that will do the exact same thing? David.
He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. But that could be any number of people. Verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. Well, again, that could have applied to any number of people who were killed or crucified down through the years after Isaiah gave the prophecy. So we're still not convinced. And then in verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Again, any number of people could have fit that description. But it gets more specific in verse 8. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. Meaning Jesus had no offspring. He hadn't married, so there were no children born to him. But we're not finished yet. And then it says in verse 9, and they made his grave with the wicked, which is to say Jesus was crucified between two, well, they were called criminals. Whatever their crime was, he was crucified with them, but with the rich at his death. And of course, he was buried in a rich man's tomb. So there are a lot of parallels here that are a little more specific. And Isaiah could never have thought of all of that and put it together, and then he wasn't around 800 years later to make it happen.
Perhaps the most discussed and debated prophecy that is attributed to a New Testament Messiah is the chapter of Isaiah 53. To all Christians, at least all Christians who actually take the time out to read the Old Testament anyway, this serves as undeniable proof that the coming of Christ was prophesied in the Hebrew Scriptures. The only reason that one would think this is true is due to the text going through various mistranslations, thus going through various misinterpretations, while also not having the proper knowledge of the context surrounding not just the book of Isaiah, not just the books of the other prophets, but the context of the entire Old Testament. When we cross-reference this passage in Isaiah with other writings and prophetic books in the Tanakh, we are able to reveal the true subject of this 53rd chapter in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 53 is commonly labeled as the passage of the suffering servant. This suffering servant passage actually begins towards the end of the 52nd chapter. Isaiah 52, 13 to 15, see, "My servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness, so he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand." Pay attention to that last section. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. This is an important detail to remember when going into chapter 53. Isaiah 52, 13 to 15 is spoken from YAH's point of view. In verse 13, he is speaking about his servant. Verse 15 sets up the context leading up to chapter 53, which is written from the point of view of the other nations. Isaiah 53, verses 1 and 2. "Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of Yahweh revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form or comeliness. And when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." The point of view in this first section is from the perspective of the kings of other nations. To paraphrase, they're asking, who would ever believe what we are seeing? These are the same kings of other nations that were mentioned at the end of chapter 52. Remember that Isaiah 52, 15 states kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. These kings are shocked because they are surprised by what they are seeing. Well, what are they seeing? Or what will they be seeing? Verse 1 also asks, "And to whom is the arm of Yahweh revealed?" Or, to whom are the works of Yahweh revealed? The only people that Yahweh ever dealt with directly are the children of Israel. The only people who knew his works and plans were the children of Israel. The overall suffering servant in this passage is the children of Israel. It's evident that Israel is YAH's servant from Isaiah chapters 44 and 45. Isaiah 44, 1. "But now listen, Jacob, my servant, Israel, whom I have chosen." Isaiah 45, 4. "For the sake of Jacob my servant, of Israel my chosen." You might be asking, how is a large group of people referred to as one singular servant? Simply because the servant in this context is not a singular servant, but a group of people, as we can see in Isaiah 43, 10. "You are my witnesses, declares Yah, and my servant whom I have chosen." Isaiah 49, 3 continues to reinforce this point. "He said to me, You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendor." This verse will resurface towards the end of Isaiah 53. Even outside of the writings of Isaiah, the prophet Ezekiel describes this servant. Ezekiel 28, 25. This is what Yahuwah says. "When I gather the people of Israel from the nations where they have been scattered, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of the nations. Then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob." Also in Isaiah 48, 20. "Send it out to the ends of the earth. Say, Yahuwah has redeemed his servant Jacob." There are numerous examples within the writings of Isaiah alone that describe Israel as the servant of Yah. As stated earlier, the only people that Yahuwah ever dealt with directly are the children of Israel. The only people who knew his works and plans were the children of Israel. The plans of Yah were always first revealed to the people of Israel through the mouths of his prophets. The book of Psalms also aligns with this point. Psalms 147, 19 and 20. He has revealed his word to Jacob, his laws and decrees to Israel. He has done this for no other nation. They do not know his laws. Verse 2 states, "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form or comeliness. And when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." This first half of this verse describes Israel as a tender plant, which parallels Isaiah 27:6. In days to come Jacob will take root. Israel will bud and blossom and fill all the world with fruit. The second half of this verse reads, "He hath no form or comeliness. And when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." Remember, the speaker in this section is still from the point of view of the kings of other nations. This idea of not being desired carries into verse 3, while making references to the writings of Moses. Isaiah 53, verse 3, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." This same servant, Israel, is not desired, as stated in verse 2, and is despised and rejected of men, as stated in verse 3. Isaiah is referring to the promises made about the conditions of the Israelites under the curses for breaking the commandments. Despised and rejected of men matches with the curses mentioned in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. Deuteronomy 28:37. "You will become a thing of horror, a byword and an object of ridicule among all the peoples where Yahuwah will drive you." Leviticus 26 verse 19. "I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one is pursuing you." In both of these references, we see that Israel was to be an object of horror, ridicule, and hated by other nations for disobeying the law of Yahuwah. The children of Israel would become despised and rejected by the other nations. Remember, the kings of the other nations are still speaking. Verse 4 reads, "Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted." This servant bearing griefs and sorrows describes the Israelites being punished for bearing/adopting the wicked practices of other nations. This is the reason for their punishment and suffering in the first place. Isaiah 53:5 states, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed." This is the main verse that Christians use to prove the existence of a Christ figure. This verse is still written from the perspective of the other nations. Since transgression and iniquity both mean wrongdoing and sin, we could reread this verse as, "But he was wounded for our sins, he was bruised for our sins." The he is still referring to the same servant, whom we identified as the children of Israel. The Israelites were afflicted for the sins of the other nations. The Israelites were punished for the sins of the other nations, simply because they bore or adopted the sins of the other nations. They practiced the same transgressions and iniquities that the other nations around them had practiced. By his stripes we are healed. The stripes in this verse refers to the punishment or affliction that the Israelites would be under as a result of their transgressions and iniquities. You might be asking, how can the punishment of one group of people heal the rest of the nations? We'll be seeing how this is possible towards the end of the chapter. Isaiah 53:6. "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and Yahuwah hath laid on him the iniquity of us all." The kings of the other nations are still speaking. They are describing how the other nations had their own wicked customs and practices. But only the children of Israel were punished for those same wicked practices. Verse 7 states, "He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth." This oppression and affliction are describing the punishment that the nation of Israel was subjected to. This servant not opening his mouth equates to a period of time that the Israelites not calling on Yahuwah for deliverance, let alone calling on him for repentance of their transgressions. This is due to Israel not having knowledge of a past. This will also come up towards the end of the chapter. Isaiah 53:8 reads, "He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken." This servant being cut off out of the land of the living is referring to the Israelites being exiled, cut off from the promised land as a result of their sins. However, the last line of verse 8 is an example of a mistranslation that causes this chapter to be misinterpreted. "For the transgression of my people he was stricken." The original Hebrew does not say he was stricken, but rather it says they were stricken. The Hebrew reads, "Mi pasha mi naga lamo." The word lamo is what denotes they, and not he. This signifies it is not talking about one person, but a group of people. We can prove this by cross-referencing with Isaiah 48:21, which uses the exact same word. Isaiah 48:21, "He made water flow for them from the rock." In the Hebrew, Ma'im sor hazio lamawe. The Hebrew supports the servant being a group of people and not an individual, just like Isaiah 43:10. Verse 9 states, "And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth." Since the children of Israel were exiled from the promised land, they were scattered throughout the earth to dwell and serve under many wicked nations. When they die in these lands, they would literally be making their own graves among the other wicked citizens of these different nations. These other nations were also richer than the children of Israel were. Since their land was seized by a number of different nations, the children of Israel lost all of their wealth when they were sent into captivity. They were sent to these other nations as servants and slaves, as Deuteronomy 28:68 mentions. "Yahuwah will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will redeem you." Thus the nations they served under were able to economically benefit from their presence. Therefore, the captive children of Israel were also buried with the citizens of other nations who became richer due to the economic boost that their enslavement provided. The latter half of verse 9 states, "Because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth." This perfectly parallels, word for word, what is written in Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 12 and 14. "But I will leave within you the meek and humble. The remnant of Israel will trust in the name of Yahuwah. They will do no wrong. They will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths." Both Zephaniah and Isaiah are referring to the remnant of the children of Israel after their punishment, pending their deliverance and restoration to a glorious nation. Verse 10 reads, "Yet it pleased Yahuwah to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Yahuwah shall prosper in his hand." Isaiah states that it will please Yah to punish Israel. In order to understand why, we must first understand the relationship that Yah had established with the children of Jacob. Exodus 4:22 states who Yah's firstborn children are. "Then say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahuwah says, Israel is my firstborn son." Isaiah 1:2, "Hear me, you heavens, listen, heard. For Yahuwah has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me." Hosea 1:10, Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," they will be called children of the living Elohim. Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. From these verses, we see that Yahuwah plays a parental role with the children of Jacob. Knowing this, we can continue to analyze this verse in Isaiah 53. Proverbs 14 pairs with this section, which allows us to fully understand what Isaiah 53:10 is saying. Proverbs 14:24. Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. Isaiah 53:10 is explaining that it pleases Yahuwah to punish his children because proper discipline establishes correction. Verse 10 is also a mistranslation, "when thou shalt make his soul an offering for sins." In actuality, that if he made himself an offering for guilt. According to Torah, the only people who are able to be punished for their sins are the very same people who committed those sins. Also, the second half of this verse is referring to the servant, Israel, that will see offspring and have long life, if and only if they repent for their transgressions. This cannot apply to a New Testament Messiah, since he never had any supposed offspring. He was never even married. In verse 11, the point of view is shifted back to Yahuwah's point of view. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. This servant, Jacob, will begin to realize the reason for his punishment and begin to regain knowledge of his righteous past, which will undo Isaiah 1:2 and 3 as well as Isaiah 5:14. Isaiah 1:2 and 3. Hear me, you heavens, listen, earth, for Yahuwah has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its master, the donkey its owner's manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. This parallels the children mentioned in Exodus 4:22. Isaiah 5:14 states, "Therefore my people will go into exile for lack of understanding." Isaiah 53:11 describes when Israel will remember to call on Yah again and remember the path to righteousness. This servant, Jacob, will also begin to lead people of other nations down the righteous path along with him. This lines up with Isaiah 60:14. Isaiah 60:14. The children of your oppressors will come bowing before you. All who despise you will bow down at your feet. These are the same oppressors mentioned in Isaiah 53:7, Leviticus 26, and Deuteronomy 28. This also parallels Isaiah 60:10 and 11. Foreigners will rebuild your walls, and their kings will serve you. Though in anger I struck you, in favor I will show you compassion. Your gates will always stand open. They will never be shut, day or night, so that people may bring you the wealth of the nations their kings led in triumphal procession. The seed mentioned in 53:10 lines up with Isaiah 60:22 and 61:9. Isaiah 60:22. The least of you will become 1,000, the smallest a mighty nation. Isaiah 61:9. Their descendants will be known among the nations and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them will acknowledge that they are a people Yahuwah has blessed. This is how the other nations will become healed by Israel's punishment, or stripes, that were mentioned in chapter 53 verse 5. This was one of the promises made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. These other nations will abandon their wicked practices and begin to follow Torah just like the children of Jacob. They will become one with the children of Israel after their return to Promised Land, as described in Ezekiel 47:22. You are to allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the foreigners residing among you and who have children. You are to consider them as native-born Israelites. Along with you, they are to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. This chapter of Isaiah is describing Jacob, Israel, as the suffering servant. To summarize, the children of Israel bear, or adopt, the wicked sins of the other nations to practice for themselves. Since they were the only nation of people that Yahuwah directly dealt with, they were the only nation of people that were directly punished. Through their affliction, they will realize where they went wrong. They'll repent, return to the righteous path, and be restored to their former glory as a nation. The other nations will notice this, and will want to live righteously along with them. Since the children of Israel are Yahuwah's initial servants, they will act as an intercessor between him and the other nations. This was always their purpose, as described in Isaiah chapter 42 verses 6 and 7. I, Yahuwah, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles. To open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. As stated earlier, there are no prophecies that point to a New Testament Messiah within the Hebrew Scriptures. The main prophecies that are argued are either mistranslations, misinterpretations, or just completely taken out of context. You have to read the Hebrew Scriptures within the context that they were written. In order for Christianity to exist within the Old Testament, you would have to take the words of the Creator in the Old Testament out of context. Also, if Isaiah 53 is truly about the children of Israel, where are they today? Which group of people today best fit the description?